Hello, hi, this is Reverend Bob Zanicki, speaking to you from the Manse on Wednesday afternoon, and I trust you are all well and keeping safe as we continue to go through this virus situation. This past Sunday, we had services at our church, and all went well. I think, a meaningful service, and hopefully many of you that were not able to be there, you've watched it on YouTube. We did have a bit of a problem with the live streaming, but we believe we have that fixed now. So, and if you're able to make it, and if you're feeling safe to come out this coming Sunday, I trust you will. Look forward to seeing you. Otherwise, we trust that the live streaming is ready to go, and also that it'll be taped so that one can watch it later on. So, my friends, I would like to continue talking to you, sharing with you from the book of Acts, our earliest Christian history of the Christian church, and we find this in our Bible. The revolution has begun. It's one way to phrase it. There'd be other ways, of course, but the way the early Christians looked at this, and again, keeping in mind that the earliest of Christians were Jewish, and they were looking for a Messiah, and they felt that they found that Messiah in Jesus as Christ. The Greek word Christ is Messiah in Hebrew. And so they looked to their scriptures, what were the scriptures? The scriptures were their Hebrew scriptures. And in point of fact, we say the Old Testament, but in point of fact, generally speaking, within the Roman world at that time, the Hebrew scriptures that they would have normally been going through, looking at, reading, studying, would have been in the Greek language from the 2nd century BCE, before Christ, that the Jews had developed through, I believe it was in Alexandria. They had from the Hebrew, they had the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek because of the dispersion of Jews throughout the known world at that time around the Mediterranean. Many of them did not know Hebrew, but they did know Greek. And so the Septuagint, that's the name that's given to it, is the Hebrew translation into Greek. So many of the earliest Christians would have used that Greek Septuagint translation as they did read and look to the scriptures for finding out things about what perhaps was there to talk about the coming Messiah. So the revolution has begun, though. The level here that I'm referring to is the understanding of the early Christians of God's fulfillment in God calling the Hebrews out of Egypt. In the early chapters of Genesis, I believe it's chapter 12, but it may be off a little bit, but where Abram is called by God to travel to the west, to what becomes Israel. That when Abraham does this, he's going over there, and whenever he gets there, they are to be the Jews, which later on became known as the Jews rather than the Hebrews, the Ipri. That's another name for them in the ancient times. They were to be God's chosen people, but they were to be there as a light to the nations. In other words, this concept of the one God, not polytheism, but rather there's only one God. And the Jews, the Hebrews, were to live that way and follow that the only God's command, and also by doing so to be an example to the nations, a light to the nations. And so let me read you a couple of scriptures that testify to this as early Christians, Jews, searched their scriptures about how these non-Jews, these at that point in 2,000 years ago, the Roman era, what were called pagans, that they were to become part of this Messianic movement. So in Isaiah 42, verse 6, I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness, I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. There was a covenant there that God gave, was given between God and the people of Israel, that God will be with them and guide them and bless them. But they had to fulfill their part of the covenant by obeying God, following God's ethical commandments, living accordingly within society, and not just within their own ranks, but there are those scriptures that talk about not defrauding, not being mean or to those others outside of their tribes, their clans, their people, their ethnos, their nations. Okay. Also in Isaiah 49, several chapters later, 49:6, he says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." And again, this was something that was just taking hold through the non-Jews, the pagans, those God-fearers that I mentioned to you before, that they were excited about this God that the Jews were following. And so when the pagans stepped in to become followers, they were not coming from the full initiation understanding of what Judaism was, so they had a lot to catch up with in terms of what these laws were, what God wanted, but also they had to give up. They had to give up their family gods. This God, quote, was a jealous God. There was only one, and that God did not want these other gods being held on to. So that was a major radical revolutionary shift also. And it caused, within the pagan ranks, for these non-pagan pagans become Christians, they had troubles. They had troubles within the ranks of their own families, within their communities, because they wouldn't participate in the normative worship of the idols and giving sacrifices to the different gods and such. So it was a big deal. So the Jews were to be a light to the nations, and many Jews at that time, some that became followers of Christ, found these texts, these scriptures. In fact, looked it up here to remind myself that the New Testament itself has around 250 quotes from the Old Testament, just directly quoted. Okay. Also, there are 1,000 plus indirect quotes and partial quotations from the Hebrew Scriptures, from what we call the Old Testament. So again, the earliest Jewish followers of Jesus, who later became known as Christians, okay? And I dare say that there are scholars saying today, and I tend to agree with them, that those earliest of Jews did not consider themselves non-Jews, never. They were merely following what they believed to be their Messiah, okay, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, okay? But there was no sense of them stepping away from Judaism and probably even maintaining certain, at least the earliest ones, certain rules of behavior, such as probably kosher and circumcision. Now, over a period of generations, that changed, but also the issue was also primary. As the Gentiles were coming in, the big question was within the Jewish ranks, who were of the majority at the beginning, okay, well, what do we do with these non-Jews, these pagans, these Gentiles? What do we do with them? Do we accept them as Christians? Do they first have to become Jews, which would include male circumcision and also kosher? And as you've heard me in the last couple of weeks, you see that the kosher distinction has been basically set aside for the non-Jews, okay? And also one could argue that for Jews sitting at table with the non-Jews that are followers, they too would not need to follow that. And that gets argumentative, conjectural as to how many generations would have passed in terms of Jewish folk feeling comfortable with giving up those two traditions, okay, and maintaining being followers of Jesus. But certainly for the non-Jew, the pagan, the ex-pagan, becoming a Christian, that was not to be the case. But early on, the argument was within the ranks of those who were Jews that were following Jesus, does not a Gentile need to become a Jew first in terms of these requirements to then be initiated into actually being a follower of Christ? And of course, Paul says no to that. So I'll just read you a few verses here today, and then we'll pick up this later next week in chapter 11. Now the apostles and the brethren who were in Judea heard that the Gentiles, the pagans, also had received the word of God. Now these, again, we gather they would have been those that were God-fearers who had some interest originally in the Jewish tradition, in the Jewish faith, in the God of the Jews. Okay, so when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcision party criticized him. So that gets into now this issue of there were some Jews, perhaps the majority of them to begin with, that took it for granted. Well, any non-Jew that wishes to become a follower of the Messiah would need to be circumcised and follow the dietary laws. Okay, so again, when we read this in Acts chapter 11, keeping in mind this has been written late first century, even perhaps into the early second century. By this time, the thinking had pretty well been established by the majority grouping of Christians. There was never 100% agreement. There never will be. Okay, but that by this time, the person writing the book of Acts, this book of Acts, calls these others, because they're disagreeing with them, the circumcision party. So right there's that idea. That's a distinction between the ones that wrote this, the one that wrote this, and the community that would be reading it, and those saying the circumcision party. There's a disagreement. And so the circumcision party is asking, why did you go to uncircumcised men and eat with them? But Peter began and explained to them in order. Well, I was in the city of Joppa praying, and a trance came, a vision, and he goes on to say what happened to him about the food being clean, because God says it's clean. But that didn't convince everybody within the Jewish ranks of the earliest followers of Jesus. And so we're going to see this played out through the book of Acts and also in Paul's letters, that there were these folks. In fact, Paul's letters are earlier than this writing of Acts. So they're actually 40 years earlier, when Paul was in the thick of it, debating with those, quote unquote, those of the circumcision party. Okay, so my friends, I hope you're finding this interesting. It's foundational and fundamental, the things we don't necessarily know about because, well, we're 2,000 years hence. But this changeover where the pagans, non-Jews, recognized this one God, and that was a fundamental distinction for them that changed their lives in a tremendous way, but in a challenging way. And of course, for our Jewish friends, most of them maintained their Judaism and went on with their lives, and Judaism developed as in ever strength after strength in terms of their understanding of what God wanted for them. But for those early Jews who became followers of Jesus, they were looking to their own Bible, their Old Testament, Septuagint, to find those hints, those pieces of the scriptures that would be talking about the future of how the Messiah would come. And they took those scriptures and they applied them into the New Testament. So God bless you. If you're able, if you're up to it, I hope to see you Sunday. If not, please be sure to live stream us or to go to the video on YouTube after the service on Sunday. God bless you. If I can ever be of some help, please call my office. Call me, 570-417-2103. And I want to do what I can, but I miss us all getting together on a regular basis. And may you have the rest of the week go well with you. Again, stay safe. God bless, and talk to you soon.